I'm live here with Angie Moon, who is a leftist and a activist as well as well, why don't I just let you introduce yourself because you'd probably better describe yourself than I could.
Okay, so hi, I'm Angie Moon. Politically, I describe myself as a left libertarian independent, and what I mainly do is talk about music from like a social justice representation sort of angle. So my blog is called The Diversity of Classic Rock. You can find it on crazyOnClassicRock.com.
Yeah, and I myself have done some blogging, not necessarily on music or culture like that, but I've noticed with some of your work, you have integrated almost like a historical perspective on it, looking into who started these kinds of things. And I'm wondering how you kind of got started with that particular genre of writing.
Okay, so basically, I've always had an interest in history ever since I was a kid. History class was like my favorite class back when I was in secondary school. And I got into classic rock when I was around 14 years old, and I watched the movie Austin Powers when I was bored one day. And from there, I just fell in love with the 60s. And I was like, okay, why not get into the music? And then the fashion of the time period. And then my dad was a DJ in the 70s, and he definitely encouraged me to follow some of my passions and what I'm really interested in. So it wasn't until later that I got into writing, and it was all a complete accident. I to tell the story actually recently on my blog. I did post about my early beginnings in writing, but my original goal was actually to be a DJ on a classic rock radio station. And if you listen to classic rock radio, there aren't a lot of female DJs on those stations. And I wanted to break barriers in that way, but for whatever reason that didn't happen. So I took the writing path. And actually, I did radio while I was in university. So when I was in university, I studied communications and I studied journalism. Communications as my undergrad, and then journalism as my master's. And while I was in university, both in my undergrad and in during my master's, I did radio, and I had a classic rock radio show. And in the first radio station I was at, which was in Chicago, a station that prided itself on, playing a wide variety of music. Now, at the time, I was very much a classic rock purist, although I did make some exceptions for new, kind of like new bands that sounded like classic rock. So things like Temples and Tame Impala. I really liked that back then, still do. And I remember the people running the station were really upset and said, "Oh, you only play music by old white men, and that's all classic rock is." And I was like, "No, that's not true at all." And it took a year for me to come up with this idea, to make it realize the diversity of classic rock. So I came up with the idea when I was 19, and then I just started researching and researching. That's all I did. Even when I was in university, I didn't really care so much about schoolwork, although I did very well. I was just looking up classic rock stuff. So I was just reading up everything I could. Back when I lived in Canada and I went to university there, I was, in the library. We had like, I went to York University, and they had these, the stacks in the library, and they were like 5 stories tall, the library stack. So it was just 5 stories of books. And I just go find myself in the classic rock section, pick up all these classic rock books, read them. I'd also read fashion books. I'd also like watch a lot of movies in their movie library, which was really awesome. And then, I started the diversity of classic rock as part of a school assignment in my undergrad, third year of my undergrad. And I just kept going because I really loved writing and I loved educating people on classic rock. And that's pretty much all I do now. I mean, I did try YouTube. I have done YouTube off and on ever since I was a teenager, but never really got anywhere with it. But the diversity of classic rock is so far my most successful venture.
It's funny that you mentioned that you got into writing as an accident, because I had a similar experience during my college years. So initially, I had no appetite for writing at all. High school, I didn't think I could write. I didn't think I could do any of that. And then I started kind of getting into politics and things like that. And one of the things I found out was I had a very strong connection to argumentation. And when I went to college and I started writing, I kind of found that I loved it, especially when I started getting paid for writing my opinions. So it's interesting to see like when you have somebody who like yourself who has this one interest that they really hold on to, and then it transfers over into an interest that is completely unexpected. So, would you say in a similar way like that, your YouTube career has been like that as well, like where you've found new niche things as you've gone along that has kind of contributed to your content, or would you say that this has kind of just been something you've gone through throughout your career?
Well, I had an interest in YouTube because another interest of mine was theater and performance. So I was a theater kid back when I was a kid. So, I did theater camp. In secondary school, though, I had really awful theater teachers. A lot of them just played favorites. And actually, in secondary school, I had a homophobic theater teacher. And I remember these two girls were going to do a skit where they broke up, and the teacher was like, "You can't do that." And I was just like, I don't know how someone could be a homophobic theater teacher. It just didn't make any sense because, theater is definitely like a refuge for a lot of LGBT, people. But yeah, I got out of theater when I was in secondary school. I just quit after the first year of secondary school. I was like, yeah, I can't do that. But another reason I just didn't do theater, very many extracurriculars back then, I didn't really have a life then, was because I wanted to graduate early. But YouTube was sort of a hobby, and I did do it while I was in secondary school, but I did rants. And I think one of my biggest influences then was The Amazing Atheist.
Oh
Now, I'm not
yeah.
as much of a fan of his work now, but back then I really was. He was a huge influence on me. So I have to acknowledge him there.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that The Amazing Atheist influenced your perspective because a lot of, and you've described yourself as like a populist leftist, Kyle Kalinske, that kind of, and Jimmy Dore, those kind of leftists. A
Yep.
lot of, and this is just in my experience, the leftists who tend to lean towards that kind of content also have a history with, at the very least, being exposed to commentary similar to The Amazing Atheist and other not necessarily skeptic YouTubers, but more of that ranty style. So, if you had to say like that kind of content and how it influenced you, how would you describe it?
So the Amazing Atheist, well, I would never say like a lot of people call him a skeptic. I used to also like Shoe on Head back when I was in university, and she was also an influence as well. And I don't, it would be wrong of me to say she was never an influence on me. But I think what people do get wrong about Shoe and Amazing Atheist is that a lot of people characterize them as right wingers because they are against PC culture or they have a bit of an edgy sense of humor. And I'm like, I think you can have those things and still be a leftist. I mean, Kyle Kalinske is very much like that. Jimmy Dore is very much like that. Joe Rogan's not a leftist, but yeah, Joe Rogan, his sense of humor isn't very PC at all. But at the end of the day, I think he'd find that he does support a lot of things that people on the left do. So yeah, I think it was also just a frustration with a lot of PC culture stuff because I did experience that a bit in secondary school where I remember I was trying to do a little sketch comedy and they were like, you can't make that sort of joke. And I was like, but why? They're like, oh, someone will get offended. I'm like, no one's going to get offended by this.
So you
I
would.
think that's,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, no, go ahead.
So if you're, so what I'm getting from what you're describing is more or less you can have this form of edgy content and this kind of ranty style while at the same time still upholding many of the principles that many more PC left wingers also hold to, and that they're not mutually exclusive. Um, it's funny that you mentioned that because a lot of the content that I see, even among left like people that would describe themselves or be described by their critics as PC, does still have edgy commentary laced into it. So if you had to, oh, sorry about that, I got a little distracted by something on the computer. If you had to kind of distinguish between like how you see certain members of the PC left versus say people who are more inclined in edgy commentary, do you think that there's like this like absolute distinction, or do you think it's much more interconnected?
I definitely think nobody hates leftists more than other leftists. Kind of like the cliche, nobody hates women more than other women. I actually wrote like a little rant about this on Medium today, and I quoted the Kinks song "Hatred a Duet" in it, and it's just about like that song just pokes fun at the two Davis brothers rivalry, and yeah, I think the left definitely hate each other a lot, and I think like here's just what my thought is on this. So I was never an SJW or anything like that. But I think it's just those sorts of leanings and the PC leanings turn a lot of people off. And you do see similar leanings, but just the flip side of the coin on the right. And I think it's just a lot of people just get hung up on the small differences. Like there's a narcissism of small differences between, people who, are 90% in agreement, 80% in agreement, maybe 70% in agreement. I think I found on Twitter, on my various adventures on there, that
Oh
I've
Lord.
had more fierce disagreements with other leftists than I have with right wingers or neoliberals or centrists, which I found very odd. I think they just come to me just expecting, an opposition to what they believe, and maybe I've opened some of their minds. I really hope I have. I know that I've learned things from following people from other sides, but oh my gosh, where was I on this? Like just the left and like the SJW side versus the anti or not the anti but like the PC side versus non-PC
Yeah.
side. Like I never thought that the SJWs or PC side. I keep using old language here, but I never thought that they had bad intentions. I think I think almost all of them are good intentioned people. It's just I think we have different ideas of what's best for the left or what's best for the future of, the country, the world, whichever scale we're talking about.
Oh, that's actually kind of interesting because a lot of times when you see these distinctions between the non-PC left and the PC left, there's a lot of demonization and things like that. So it's actually kind of cool to see that you have pointed out that it's not necessarily a matter of personal character, but a matter of ideas and consequences of those ideas. Um, but circling back to what we were talking about earlier with the diversity of rock program that you kind of set up, I was curious what motivated you to kind of take that stuff and go into like interviews and eventually like video essays and politics, because while some might not necessarily see the diversity in as a political enterprise in like public discourse, you seem to have found that niche connection between diversity in classical rock and online commentary.
Yeah, it's really interesting how like politics are seen in both, and I think it's just I actually have done a whole series on my blog about political classic rock songs. So I think I did a four-part series on that, and I want to do a fifth part, but this time about socialist lyrics, because I think a lot of people are afraid of the word socialism. And yeah, I think it's just I see those things as just very separate. Like what I did on YouTube and all the politics stuff, I try to keep that separate from my blog because, like, what I do on my blog is I want to make it my happy place where I can talk about music because it does cheer me up in just such a depressing world. Because I moved around a lot as a kid, I struggled with depression, I struggled with anxiety, and music was always there for me. Movies were always there for me, cartoons were always there for me, media was always there for me. And I think when I do the diversity aspect of my blog, it isn't just about ethnicity. I think that's what some people might be confused if they see the title. They're thinking, oh, all she's going to do is just race bait and talk about the race of this musician, the race of that musician, and talk all about their sexuality and all that. And I'm like, no, I mean, it's about the people behind the music. And each person has an interesting story behind them. And, diversity is more than just ethnicity. It's more than just sexuality. It's more than gender. It's more than all that. I mean, everybody has their own unique story. And I don't like that people will, just judge based on, visuals and their site based on, oh yeah, they think this group is not diverse or that group's not diverse. I mean, everybody's very different. And I guess, as my dad always put it, people are all individuals. Treat everybody as an individual.
Mm. And I'm actually really glad you brought that point up because a lot of times when there's discussion surrounding diversity, some of the critics, particularly on the right, will say things along the lines of, I'm not interested in diversity of identity, I'm interested in diversity of ideas, as if those things are mutually exclusive. And one of the things that I learned from my bachelor's thesis in history is that there is a lot of intersecting ways in which identity and ideas can be interconnected. Like if you talk about how a bisexual artist is making music, though the ideas that influence that music come from that person's experiences. So I'm curious how you've kind of encapsulated that in your blog while also dealing with the ways in which people perceive diversity, and how you've navigated that.
So what do you want me to talk about? Like, I'm a little confused. I'm
No,
like,
I'm sorry,
sorry.
it just got a little jumbled up. But
Yeah, no
basically,
worries.
the idea is if a person, if a group of people view something as inherently focused solely on identity, how do you show them that there's more to it than that, while also still getting them to listen to you in the first place?
I think I just, I explain it like, I mean, I introduce myself in my blog. I do talk a lot about my identity throughout my writing. So a lot of people, they might be aware that, okay, well, I'm a mixed race person. My mother was from Venezuela, or she is from Venezuela, she's still alive. Her family are mixed. I know that a lot of people would never guess that from my appearance, but, how I look isn't representative of how my mother's family would look. So my mother's mother was part native, her father was part black, and then my dad's family are all Jewish. Um, and I do talk about being bi. I'm very open about that. I have been openly bisexual since the age of 14. I'm an atheist. I used to be Jewish. I have autism. But yeah, I think it's just, I think I show how everybody's different. Everyone's a minority in some way, somewhere in the world. I think that's one point that I do like to make. Everybody's a minority in some way. I mean, do you have blonde hair? You have blue eyes? Well, you're a minority. I mean, most people in the world have black hair and brown eyes. Um, everybody's, different in so many different ways. And I think the thing is, a lot of conservatives do like classic rock. It's old stuff, and conservatives do like the old things. And I think a lot of boomers, they love classic rock. I mean, they grew up on it. But I think there's just so much more to it than, the same old musicians that they play on the radio station. And there's just so many interesting stories of the people, who make the music. And, whenever I do talk about their sexuality, I mean, I also include facts about their music. And like, I didn't only just talk about musicians who are LGBT, for example. I also talked about songs with those themes. And they're not always by, gay musicians. Sometimes they're by straight musicians, who are allies and very supportive. And then as well, in the diversity thing, I also am starting to work on doing music from different parts of the world, because a lot of our, music listening, it's all in English. If you're, assuming that the viewers here are English speakers, living in the Anglosphere, for example, or even, people outside the Anglosphere, much of what you listen to is in English, because of, America's, culture spreading, and then Britain's culture spreading. And I think there's just so much more to music than what you can understand in the languages you know. And luckily, because I do know a couple of other languages, so I know Spanish, and then I can read very basic French. So that definitely helped give me some perspective on, there being just a whole world out there that is not just, music in English.
Well, I think it's actually pretty cool that you describe it as like you're trying to look at things from as large of a picture as you can. Like, and for me, I've only been outside the country once, so my experiences with other cultures, particularly in other languages, is relatively limited. But I know you're from Ireland, and then you stayed in Canada, as you mentioned earlier.
I'm from Chicago originally.
Oh, you really?
I live in Ireland. I've only been living here since 5 years ago.
Okay. Because when I looked into your
Yeah, no
stuff, you
worries.
were describing it. Okay, so you've started off from the American perspective and then went to Ireland.
Yeah. I was born in the U.S.
Okay, so you've that's interesting.
I've just spent most of my adult life outside the U.S.
So that's interesting. So if you had when you were when you moved, when did you move to Ireland?
Okay, so there's a long story about the places I've lived. So I've spent about half of my life in the Chicago area. And then I lived in Texas. I've also lived in Florida. When I was 17 years old, I moved to Toronto and then spent a bit of time there before going back to Chicago. And I first went to Ireland back in 2014, and that's how I met my husband. So 3 years after that, my husband and I got married, and I'm still here because my husband's doing his PhD.
Oh, that's jeez. That I gotta. That's honestly,
It's
it's
a
hard to
crazy
imagine
story.
like the long amount of travel and just trying to get to know so many different cultures. It's no wonder you got into this. Um, but a reason I brought that
Yeah, I mean,
up.
my grandparents traveled a lot. My dad, he's American, but he met my mother, who's Venezuelan. Basically, my dad's always had a fascination with Latin America ever since he was in secondary school and took Spanish. And he, on his own initiative, got better and better at Spanish to the point where he speaks it perfectly well. You wouldn't even know he's an Anglo from the way he speaks. And he took a lot of initiative, making Latin American friends in university. And, he also, not only did he have friends from Latin America, he also had friends from Africa. And, he lived all over the US, and then he Venezuela for a time 40 years ago. But that's not how he met my mother. He met my mother in Houston, and that was on Halloween 1989. And then, like, less than a year later, my parents were married.
Jeez, that's one heck of a story. But the reason
Oh
I
yeah, my
asked,
mother, yeah, like my mother just came to the US when she was in her late 20s, just wanting to get out of Venezuela. She just didn't want to marry a man from there, and she likes America a lot. So, like, I think she's probably one of the most American people I know, despite not being born there or raised there.
well, and the reason I bring that up is because you speak about all these different perspectives and the ways in which, in the way you put it, was everybody's a minority to in some extent. So I'm wondering, would you say that your experiences with your family traveling and the constant like movement contributing to your perspective on what diversity means and how that influences music, or would you say that you've
Yeah,
drawn upon that
I
in?
always, yeah, I always stood out in some way, like ever since I was a kid. When I was in secondary school, I mean, there were other, non-white and mixed kids, but, or not really, well, I guess mixed in some way, because a lot of the Hispanic kids, they are mixed. Most Hispanic people are mixed. But I was like the one Hispanic kid that also had a white parent. So I definitely, I was definitely a confusion to a lot of kids. I wasn't confused, but they were. Because, I walked in, they didn't know I was Latin American because I spoke like any other person there. Don't have any bit of Spanish in my accent at all. Um, but as soon as they met my mother and my grandmother, because I was also raised by my grandmother. So my grandmother, she looked completely native, and, she had dark skin, very pin straight black hair, very dark eyes, very short. But yeah, as soon as they saw my grandmother, yeah, everybody, it was just the giveaway. Everybody knew there is something up. There is something different about her. And then, like, in another way, I was definitely a minority. So I was put into Hebrew school when I was 10 years old, and I didn't know any other people who were the exact mix I was. So my dad's a Jew, my mom's Hispanic. I didn't know anyone else like that. So yeah, like I think that definitely influenced, why I went into diversity in classic rock, because through that I found just so many musicians who were mixed like me, and I was like, how come I didn't know about this? How come nobody told me about this? But anyway, like back to my experience in Hebrew school. So because my mom's a Gentile, they didn't see me as a real Jew. I was seen as a fake, and that's when I started questioning everything, and that's when I became an atheist when I was 10, because I was like, this doesn't make any sense. So like the whole illusion of religion just shattered. It fell apart. It stopped making sense. And I was like, look, I don't want to be in a place that doesn't accept me. So, I somehow got out of having a bat mitzvah because the timing just worked. My dad, moved around a lot because he switched jobs. And, I was also like dealing with depression due to moving, because I'd always lived in the Chicago area before that, and I was living in Texas. And then my grandpa was like, okay, fine, she doesn't have to go get a bat mitzvah. And then I guess they didn't push the issue with my brother, so neither of us, went through all of that. So, like, I do somehow feel like I was born a Jew, so it's not like I don't have any identification with Jewish people or don't understand it, but there are definitely some key, rites of passage that I didn't go through.
Hmm. And and so you said that they wouldn't accept you because your mother was a Gentile, correct? Is that I just
Yeah, they
the
would
audio
make
cut
me
out for me?
convert, is what would happen. If I went to a Reform synagogue, I would have definitely been accepted, no question about it. But the nearest synagogue to me was a conservative one. So conservative is closer to Reform than Orthodox if we look at the spectrum, but it is definitely more strict than Reform. But I never observed the Sabbath. I didn't observe any of the high holidays. No, I went to services for Rosh Hashanah, I think, once, and I was kind of falling asleep. I did not like it.
So it's almost as if like with your travels and with your experiences, you've both been a part of multiple cultures, but also been separated from them to an extent. Like
Oh
you're,
yeah, and separated. I feel it here more than anything. Like here where I am in Ireland, so I'm in a college town, and it is very diverse because it is a college town, and there are a lot of multinational companies that are located in Ireland because Ireland is very much a tax haven, very low corporate tax rate. And Europe is becoming more and more diverse every year as it goes by. But there are a lot of people that look very different all over the place. Like my neighborhood definitely has a lot of immigrant families. But on the other hand, I don't know anybody of my background. Like, I don't know anybody. I don't know any other Jews. I've never met another Jew here. As far as Hispanics, I have met other Hispanics. I mean, my husband's office is mostly Hispanic. Um, but or not mostly, but there's a number of Hispanic people from there, but there's none who are Venezuelan specifically. But there are some, who are from neighboring countries like Colombia.
Yeah, and like for me, because I said earlier, I've only been out of the country once. It's always interesting to see somebody describe their experiences with multiple cultures, and like you can kind of get a sense of it, but you're never really gonna experience it until you run into it. Like for example,
Oh,
when
you
I
got to see it for yourself.
oh yeah, it's interesting because I'm Irish, Italian, Polish, and German, so there's a lot going on there.
Oh
And one
yeah.
of the things that I always find interesting about learning about my family is we're actually pretty recent, at least on the Italian side, to America. Our family is about 4 generations from Italy, and Suzuna specifically. And
That's close enough that you could actually qualify for dual citizenship, I think.
well, I'll have to look into that. That'd be
Yeah, I
actually
mean,
pretty interesting.
I have a lot of cousins. A lot of my cousins are part Italian. So like they were even all looking into, oh, can I get Italian citizenship? The problem is there's a long wait list because Italy has a huge diaspora.
Yeah. But it's always interesting to see because whenever I've experienced any sect of like foreign culture, whether it's on the North American continent or just in like interactions with people in Europe, like when my interview with the Cavernacle, for example, he's in the UK. It's always been kind of interesting to see, even though there are clear distinctions, there are commonalities as well. And I was wondering, in your experience moving to different countries, what sort of commonalities have you found, and what differences have you seen between like the different people of the world?
I think like at the end of the day, people are people, no matter where you go, everybody has emotions, everybody has goals, everybody has wishes, everybody has desires, everybody has their own family traditions, everybody just wants to see their family, everybody just feels love. I think it's just down to like the individual thing and, just being human. That's I think what matters. I think every culture, I think just the differences are all superficial, like it's just, oh, the clothes look a bit different. But really, I mean, the superficial stuff is just, all based on latitude. I mean, skin
Mm.
color, the only reason that there's just different skin colors is because of different, distances the continents, the parts of the continents are from the equator. That's what resulted in the difference in skin color, hair color, eye color. That's it. It's just the environment, and the weather and all that. It's like, I think people are people no matter where you go. I definitely think there's definitely different cultural expectations for sure, and I think part of that might have to do with history in different places. Like when I was in Israel, I have family there actually. I found that people in Israel, are very, blunt and a bit on PC with their humor. I remember just people were making Holocaust jokes over there, and people were comparing, animal slaughter, and eating meat to the Holocaust. There were people doing that over there. Well, in America, I know that nobody would like that. Like when I was in Israel with the Birthright group, now that's a long story. I don't want to talk about my position on Israel and Palestine because that is a whole can of worms there. But
I don't need to
in
get
effect, I'm
spammed
not
today.
like a
Let's
big,
put it that way.
I'm not a big pro-Israel person. But
Yeah.
anyway, um, yeah, the Americans on the tour were just shocked. All of them, their mouths were agape, like, oh my god, did they seriously compare the Holocaust and eating animals? I'm like, look, I mean, that's their culture. It's a bit different. But I do think we need to stop with the cultural relativism. And I was writing a rant on this earlier. I haven't finished it yet, but I do plan on finishing at some point where, certain things, there's a line. You can't, chalk that up to different culture, like things like sexism or homophobia or racism. You can't chalk that up to a different culture. I mean, at some point, there comes a point where you have to, move on and progress. Times have changed. And I think people just have to be accepting. And
It's interesting that you mentioned like the distinctions like between like well, not necessarily distinctions but the problems with cultural relativism, because there's a bit of a debate sometimes in history as to how we look at the past, because hell, even the American culture 50 years ago is different from American culture today. And one of the things that I've always kind of struggled with is where does this idea of like proper culture begin, and where does it get into like jingoism. You know, like a lot of times, unfortunately, some Americans can be quite jingoistic towards other people, um, and others are perfectly capable of doing the same. So I'm curious. I was wondering if you could expand on your thoughts on cultural relativism and the relationship between that and jingoism.
Yeah, I think with cultural relativism, the thing is, I don't like this notion that some people on the left have where they hold different cultures to lower standards. I definitely think that is a form of bigotry. I know that some people, that whole soft bigotry of low expectations, that was a quote said by a conservative, but I'm like, look, I mean, the merits of that, if we're just looking at the merits of that, forget who said it. It is true. Like, people have to be held to the same standard, you know is it okay for someone in the Middle East who's Muslim who grew up on that to be sexist to a woman and treat her like second class or to be homophobic? No, that isn't acceptable. That isn't at all. And oh my gosh, sorry, I forgot the question.
So I'm just it's all right. I've kind of hit you with some stuff that I didn't initially plan
Yeah.
on, but
Oh, like the jingoism and
yeah, and the
stuff.
jingoism as it relates to the distinctions
Right.
between criticizing cultural relativism and becoming jingoistic.
Right. Like in America, I think like what is American culture? I think a lot of Americans just, they grew up on it or anything, no matter where you're from, whatever culture you grow up with, that's your normal. That is your reference point. You know, that's why I don't like, people screaming too much about, oh, well, you're Americanocentric or Eurocentric. I'm like, but that's what the person knows. I mean, it'd be worse if I tried to speak from another country's perspective as if I, kind of like an Emily in Paris sort of thing, like pretending that I know everything about another culture. That would be wrong. People speak about what they know about. And I think it's, you need to find people from different cultures to speak about their culture. But like back to American culture and what's culture versus jingoism, I think it just comes to respecting other people and like American culture. I mean, let's just think of all the different things. I mean, it took me leaving America to realize, how rich American culture is. I mean, if we just start, I mean, simply put, the first people who were there, the indigenous people. I mean, there are so many different, Native American tribes and so many different cultures right there. But even if we, look at just the groups that came into America and, I guess made it what it is, right? I mean, all the music, like rock and roll. We wouldn't have rock and roll without America. As much as I, have an affinity for the British and European side of rock and roll, it wouldn't that wouldn't have happened without America because Britain had its skiffle, but skiffle came from like American country music and American R&B to an extent. I mean, funny enough, like the British rock stars actually appreciated R&B more than the American rock stars did. But anyway, like I think also another thing that's American culture is just Hollywood, like just movies and stuff like that, all that sort of stuff. And then I think all the different landscapes and like all the different fashions and all these different subcultures. Food is a big one, and I think just America's
Yep.
just it is a real melting pot, and I think that is a good thing. It is a strength, that no matter what you look like in America, you'll fit in somewhere. It's just all about finding people you get along with and you know keeping an open mind.
Yeah,
But
and
then jingoism is when you espouse racist stuff and xenophobic stuff and act like America's the best country in the world. And even early on as a teenager, I recognized that America isn't unique, really. I mean, you can have a great standard of living in Canada. I mean, I had friends in Canada who were very happy. I have family there too. I knew people in the UK who were, very happy living good lives. And there's people all over Europe living good lives. There's people all over the world living good lives. It's really all about money. It all comes down to money. When you have money, you can live a good life. If you don't, that's, I think, what separates people mostly is money.
and it's I really like how you point out that as much as there are many differences, there's a need for respect, even when you're critiquing the problems within the culture itself. Like for example, we can point out that the relationship between the United States and the Saudi Arabian government has enshrined some pretty extreme cultural tendencies in Saudi Arabia and made it harder to critique them without like condemning every Saudi Arabian or the people as if it were inherent to them. Um, but you, as you described earlier, how America and Canada, like they have, there are things that aren't necessarily unique about the United States because Canada also has them. I'm curious how, like, in and this is just me making a comment because I remember from one of your videos you mentioned how you don't have student loan debt. I am very jealous of you. So, but
Yeah.
one of the thing, what if you could like go into some of your experiences as it relates to Canada and how the economic influences of Canada, what was distinct for you when you went to Canada versus what you saw in the United States?
I definitely think, like, I mean, I'll just explain why I don't have student loans. So, I have talked about being working class now, but the thing is, like, class is something that can change. However, I think there is a big difference between someone who's been working class their whole entire life versus someone who grew up wealthy or, well off middle class and became working class later on. I mean, class is something that is fluid, although it should be more fluid as in moving up, and it's harder to move up than to move down. I mean, I think of it like grades. Okay, I got all A's on all my assignments, and then suddenly, oh, I got a B. Why did my grade drop so much? Oh, I'm okay. I'm not doing so well in this class. Suddenly, I get an A. Oh, how come my grade didn't go up at all? That's definitely like what class moving up and down in class feels like. But yeah, I got lucky. My grandfather is an accountant. He had money, although he was a self-made man. His family were quite poor when they came to the U.S. So my grandfather's parents were immigrants. Um, my grandfather's father's side of the family all came to the U.S. just fine, but his mother's side of the family, some of them made it over to the U.S., others didn't. And I think that's something that I wish would be discussed in critical race theory is, oh my gosh, I'm going off on so many tangents, but
Don't worry,
like in critical
go
race theory.
off.
Okay, so in critical race theory, I mean, a lot of things are talked about. Like, I think what annoys me about race relations discussion in the US is that it's all black and white and that's it. When hardly, like, can we discuss Native Americans? Can we discuss Hispanics? Can we discuss Asians? How come that's never discussed? Like, we hardly ever discussed Asians and their experiences in the US or Hispanics and their experiences in the US. We just didn't discuss that at all. Mixed people, again, but anyway, white people weren't even all treated exactly the same in the US. One fact that just blows my mind entirely is that as far as presidents, I mean, I'm not going to get all identity politics like, oh, I'd love this to happen necessarily. I'm not, like, for me, it's all about the person's ideas and what's in their heart, not about, what their identity is. But in the US, there has never been a president of Mediterranean or Eastern European descent. There just hasn't been that. I mean, if you just look at the last names, I don't see a single Eastern European name or a Mediterranean name like a Spanish or Italian name, Greek name. You just don't see that. And I think part of it is because those immigrant groups immigrated later, but also those groups were treated worse. And like there was a quota. That's why I think my grandfather's mother's family weren't all able to make it over. So they immigrated over before the quota, but then there was a quota put in on Eastern Europeans and Mediterraneans. And yeah, my family couldn't all make it over. So anybody who was left over there died in the Holocaust. And I didn't know that I descend from a Holocaust victim, not who died. My great-great-grandfather died in the Holocaust, and then some of my great-grandmother's siblings died in the Holocaust as well. Anyone who was left over there died. The entire town died. I think all their Jewish population dead.
Oh my God.
But yeah, my grandfather, he studied accounting. He went to Ohio State, and he worked very, very hard to get to where he was. I mean, I think he enlisted in the military, but then he almost got sent over to Japan. But because his mother got very sick just in time, right before he was supposed to get on the boat, he went straight from Seattle back to New York City, where he was from, to see his mother. And luckily, she survived. She made it. And then my grandfather just went to university after that, studied accounting. Met my grandmother there. My grandmother came from a well-off family, so it was like it's gonna be weird to use a Disney analogy, but it was like Lady and the Tramp or a situation there. But basically, they lived a pretty good life. My grandmother came from a family. Her father was the first American born in his family, and then then her mother was American as well, but her family were immigrants. But they were grocery store owners in Chicago. They owned the Royal Blue chain. But anyway, then they sold it and things kind of went to shit, but they still had money. And like my dad grew up pretty well off. Like he had a maid as a kid and lived in a pretty well off area, lived in a nice part of Evanston. And yeah, well, my dad went to university. He didn't have to worry about money. My mom, luckily, because she was from Venezuela, her dad was also pretty well off. He was a salesman who was very successful, and my mom got to go to private school. And then in Venezuela, you don't have university tuition. Like university was just being tuition free, at least ever since my mom was a kid. And yeah, like that's something that like that opened my mind. The fact that Venezuela has tuition free university, and that's a developing country. That's not like by our standards now, it's third world now because the wages are so freaking. But there is a huge like wealth disparity in Venezuela. But like my parents definitely both, they're both university educated. My mom studied bioanalysis. My dad was a communications major. My dad used to work in HR. Now he's retired. My mom worked as a phlebotomist, drawing blood. And they always, addressed the importance of education. They made sure to save up money so I could go off to university. Now the thing is, we were living in Florida, and I wanted to go to Canada. I wanted to get the hell out of America because I realized Canada just seems so much better. There was just the government there looks after the people just so much better than in America, at least from my perspective. I mean, now that I've been talking to Amanda, I've learned that Canada isn't the paradise I thought it was because of just how Indigenous people were treated there. And I think I take for granted how good my family had it because my family in Venezuela were native, but they seem to have a pretty good life. No one ever faced any racism in my family back in Venezuela. No one faced anything in Venezuela. Life was pretty good there. But I think one thing I liked about Canada was that the tuition just seemed to be a lot lower there than in most parts of the US. And biggest of all, healthcare. Like I knew that healthcare was like something that costs money in America, and it's a necessity. Like I never thought much about like the cost of healthcare. I was like, oh, it's fine. But my dad just noticed the insurance keeps getting more and more expensive, and he worked with trying to pick an insurance plan for the company, and the insurance kept getting more and more expensive. The co-pays kept getting higher and higher. And I remember seeing that in the doctor's office. I was just thinking, we're lucky we can afford that, but imagine if we were a poor family that couldn't afford that and I couldn't get the care that I needed. So I think that's a huge difference in Canada. But even then, in Canada, things aren't perfect. Like I found out that in parts of Europe, dental care is covered. Vision is covered. So if you're in the UK, dental and vision are covered under the NHS, for example. It's even better if you live in Wales or Scotland rather than in England. In England, they just get the worst, but in Scotland it's very, very good because they even have free university tuition up there. Wales, I think prescriptions are free over there, but university is less expensive than in England, but I think it's still, you gotta pay for it in Wales. But yeah, like I think that's what I learned is just other countries have better things than the US. And I was so sick of all the people around me. I lived in a conservative part of Florida. I was like, people were saying America's the best country in the world. How dare you? And I was like, look, there's other countries that have it better. And I was like trying to explain it to everyone, and people just thought it was a weirdo for saying that. But I was like, no, I'm right. And I'm lucky I've never been in medical debt. I'm lucky I don't have student loan debt because my family were well off. And I want everyone to have what I had. Or have it even better. I want everyone to have it better.
Well, and that's kind of the description I've gotten when I've talked to people outside of the United States, and how as much as there are good things with the United States and there are a lot of benefits to living here, there are also consequences, in part because of our anti-governmental attitude, I think it is. That there's a certain element of American politics and American political culture that views getting involved in the economy or the government providing some sort of assistance as inherently coercive, either to the person receiving it or to the person who pays the taxes on it. And since we're kind of getting into the economic and political elements of it, I wanted to ask how you really started getting into online political commentary, because you've dedicated a number of essays either to online political personalities or to topics like veganism, which I know very little about compared to you, probably. So I wanted to just get your perspective on that, because it's quite a leap from diversity of classical rock to here's everything wrong with Dave Rubin or Lauren Chen being a fascist for 13 minutes straight.
So, my family were always quite political, or at least my dad's side of the family. I can't really say as much about my mom's side of the family. I do know that some people in my mom's family support the PSUV, which is the Socialist Party of Venezuela. And then other people in my mom's family do not support the PSUV. So there's a bit of a divide there, but I never talked politics much with my mom's side of the family. I just haven't been to Venezuela. The last time I was there was before Chavez was president. So Chavez, I think, became president. I can't remember if it's 1998 or 1999. But the last time I was there was 1997 when I was 3 years old. So oh my gosh, I'm dating myself there. I'm 27 years old. um, but yeah, my dad's side of the family are all liberal. And we're always very outspoken. Like, politics would always come up at the table, and we'd always have the news on. My dad would always have NBC nightly news, and then MSNBC would always be on, and sometimes we'd have CNN on. Rare occasions, if my dad wants to go rage at the TV, we'd have Fox News, but most of the time he would not put on Fox News. I guess if he wanted to rage, he'd just put on the he'd put the sports channel on if he wanted to get angry. I think he just put that on because he yells at the TV if his favorite player just misses a shot or something like that.
Oh Lord.
But yeah, I mean, politics always came on, came up. My dad's family are all liberal now. Not always like the hippie cool kind of liberal. That's what I thought as a kid. Like, I was like, oh, come on, they're for like feminism and LGBT rights. Like, okay, yeah, they support LGBT people, they support women. But I was like, there's more to being liberal or on the left than that. And I wanted to make liberal, a better, label. But I find that liberalism is just not enough. I think it is right wing. Like, historically that's what it was. But anyway, my dad watched a lot of Keith Olbermann back when I was a teenager, and I liked Keith Olbermann back then, but that's because I just didn't know better. I mean, there wasn't any progressive media really when I was a teenager. It only came when I was in like university where I'd finally start seeing more and more things, but I associated a lot of these progressive ideas with SJWs back then. And I was like, oh yeah, well, I'm a liberal, but I'm a liberal who likes universal healthcare. I'm a little bit better of a liberal than, your neoliberal Democrats. And I think as a teenager, I mean, I watched a lot of TV, and back when I was 14, that's when Obama was elected president. And at first I was really excited for Obama, and my whole family were excited for him. And then they were still happy with him. My dad loves Obama so much that he would have signed he signs his emails really funny, like, okay, this is the family, and then plus Obama, plus my dad's favorite baseball player. And he signs
I almost
his emails
spit out
in a
my
funny
drink when I
way.
heard you say that.
Yeah, my dad's crazy. He's funny. But, like, I didn't like Obama because it was like, he gave up on all the promises. And I was just so frustrated with that. I didn't talk too much about that in my rants. I think I just talked about pop culture rants, but I think I might have ranted a bit about conservatives because I was surrounded by a lot of religious conservatives. I can't remember what I ranted about as a teenager. But, yeah, when I was in university, that was Obama's second term as president. Still disappointing. And like, it was very difficult being LGBT, and I think, coming out of the closet and thinking more about our rights. And the thing is, like, you can't take it for granted that everybody accepts LGBT people. Like, my family were cool with me, being bi, but that wasn't the case everywhere, and certainly not everybody, had the same reception in their own families when they came out. And then, basically, I think just, I needed somewhere to rant, and I don't see myself ever being a politician, because I'm an immigrant. I've left the United States. I'm now living somewhere else where I don't have citizenship. I will probably be moving around a lot due to the nature of my husband's job, because I think he's going into academia and he wants to work at various universities. Or possibly go into industry. Who knows what he's going to do, but it's going to involve us moving around a lot. So I could never go into politics as a politician, but also I'd be afraid of what would happen to me because, as time went and I found that these, the status quo is just not working for people. It's definitely not working for me. I find myself just trying to tread water, but I think I'm failing, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm going to go sink. And I realized, no, I don't think that social democracy is enough. I think that's a stepping stone at best, but I think what we need is, maybe we do need socialism. I mean, it's like, okay, I'm going to say it. But I think what we have to do with getting to socialism is not use the word socialism. I think I have a friend online who's definitely said the same thing as me, and I think Kyle has definitely said that sort of same stuff. But yeah, I think Kyle was also a main influence lately. Crystal Ball is a big influence. Jimmy Dore is an influence too. I know that some of my followers are not going to like me saying that I like Jimmy Dore, but hey, I do like his videos. yes, he's a bit explosive. Yes, he's fiery, but I guess I'm used to that because well, my family are Latin American, and shouting a lot is definitely something that happens. I know my mom shouts a lot at home, not necessarily about the issues that I shout about, but yeah, I think just ranting about politics because I'm like, look, I think my husband described me as just being a very, like I guess my pen is my sword basically, and that's how I fight, and that's how I, it's like my therapy session. Whenever I'm writing about something, there's my therapy session. I can't afford therapy, so that's my therapy. You guys are just at my therapy session, hearing me just complain about everything. I'm like, therapy's not going to help me out of this. Like, therapy's not going to give my husband a higher wage. Therapy's not going to get me a paying job that pays me well. I'm stuck, writing about classic rock. I tried getting a day job, but because of my disability and people discriminating against me for that, which has indeed happened, it's just really hard. And I guess with the nature of journalism here, newspapers here don't want to hire foreigners. They want to hire, people who are from here who know people here and have connections here. And I just didn't want to, get involved in any of the journalism here, like the mainstream journalism here, because they're all, just sucking off the establishment. That's all they do. And, I got frustrated with that here in Ireland too. I mean, I've just been like realizing that like, oh my God, the two main parties here are, they're just awful. They both hate poor people a lot. They do pretend, oh yeah, we're so progressive because we recently, legalized marriage equality, and yeah, we have abortion here now. But I'm like, look, we can't just stop there. We also have to look at the economic policies too. Social progress, great. But we also need economic progress. And I think over time, I've definitely become a lot more class first and realizing that. And I hate that it's because I experience these things firsthand with money. I wish that I had listened to more working class people when I was in university. And I wish I hadn't taken for granted, what I grew up with. I see it all the time, people, like people on Facebook, having all these nice things. I'm like, I just wish I had a lot of these nice things. I wish that I didn't have to worry about I wish I had a car. I don't have a car. Driving lessons are very expensive here. And I'm like, oh my God, am I ever going to be able to afford that? Am I ever going to be able to afford to have my own house? There's people my age buying houses and I'm like still behind. And I'm like, the system here is just not working for us. And I find it cathartic to just shout about that.
Well, and I've had similar, and obviously I'm not gonna compare exact experiences because everyone is unique to some extent. But I've had a similar experience with my writing. I started out writing, getting paid under the table because freshmen at my college were not technically supposed to be paid for their writing because they weren't officially part of the newspaper yet. Didn't stop me from contributing most of the articles in the opinion section, however. But one of the things that I found was I started to learn how to communicate what I was thinking and clear my mind the more I wrote. The more I was able to figure out, okay, the point A to point B to point C, the more I felt like there was a clarity, a meaning behind my perspective and what I felt about certain things. And from what you're describing, it sounds like you had a similar experience in which writing became your sort of organizational method for the madness that goes on around you in a way. And just to wrap it up, because I don't want to take too much of your time, I was curious when it came to your what your projects are doing and with Diversity of Rock. Are there any interviews that you want us to pay particular attention to? Because I'd be happy to spread them around.
Like interviews and articles, I just say any of them. Like whatever that you love, because I write about such a variety of things. I want people to just, find, like, there's something for everyone on my blog. I like to think that my blog is like Chinese food. There's something for everyone. I think you'll find something that you like and you're going to find something interesting. And I think the biggest thing that you can do for me, if you can't afford to donate to me on Patreon, I get it because everybody's struggling with money. It doesn't matter how well off you are. I remember Kyle Kalinske just talking about how even the most well off people, can't afford health care. And they're finding that that's a problem, that they can't get the medical care that they need. And I'm like, look, if you can't afford basics, how can you afford to donate to anyone else? But I think the biggest thing that you can do for any online creator is share their work. and I have a lot of big plans for my blog. I'm not sure if I'm going to be taking a hiatus soon. I'll see. I'm just constantly thinking of my writing. That's always what runs through my head. But yeah, absolutely share whatever I do. But I want to say this. I am working on a big project right now, and I will reveal this much. It is a book. I'm working on a book about classic rock. I don't want to elaborate any more on that at this time, but I am working on a book. It is probably going to be self-published because I have no idea if any publisher would want to touch my work. Even though there's not going to be anything political about it, there might be some controversial aspects in it, but I will reveal more once it's finished. I have finished the first section of it, but there are 5 sections, and it is really exciting, this project. I just have to, probably do a one-track mind sort of thing on it. Maybe I have to do that, because I am juggling a lot with my blog. I am the only person that works on the diversity of classic rock. If you just see all that I do, I'm the one making all the Instagram posts. I'm the one doing all the interviews. I'm the one answering all the emails. I'm the one, doing all the researching, the writing, putting together the playlists, doing the graphics, doing everything. If I had the money, I would be hiring someone to help me out with this. But yeah, I think the biggest thing that anyone can do is just spread the word about the diversity of classic rock. My website is crazyonclassicrock.com. I think what I should do is just give you all my links,
and I'll send them around.
So you can share them. Yeah, absolutely. And I will be sharing this interview on my website when it's up on YouTube and when it's up on Spotify. Absolutely, because I do want to spread this around. I want to also help your podcast as well.
Thank you very much. Well, I like to say
My pleasure.
It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I really liked your videos. I even watched them when I was on the campaign trail. So I really appreciate you coming on. It was nice to finally meet you. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you so much. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. As always, you can check out my social media and other works with the links on my About page. I also wanted to thank you all for getting me to 100 subscribers. I really appreciate it, and I have no idea how I came this far without you. I'm currently preparing to move into my new apartment, so if the video for the 100 subscriber celebration is a bit later than planned, then I apologize for that, but I'll get to it as soon as possible. Thanks again for all your support. I couldn't have done it without you.